that people can have gluten and not have a problem?
Well, I think if you could avoid glyphosate, people could have gluten and not have a problem. Basically, it's a matter of getting rid of glyphosate. And if you've been eating glyphosate-contaminated food for a long time, it's accumulated in your body, so it's going to be difficult to get rid of it. It's not easy to get rid of it once it's there, unfortunately.
That's part of the story. It sticks around for a long time. And the Monsanto's trying to say it goes away in like a month.
Right.
Or
Yeah, they say 2 weeks, it'll just go right through the urine, leave it through the urine in 2 weeks. And unfortunately, some of it sticks around. And the Monsanto knows that because their own studies found they exposed animals. There's a particular one on bluegill sunfish where Anthony and I have talked about that in one of our papers. And I think I've talked about it in the book as well. This was back in the 1980s. They exposed bluegill sunfish to radio-labeled glyphosate so they could track the radio label. And then they looked at the tissues and they looked for a radio label in the tissues and they found it in lots of tissues. And then they said, well, let's see if there's glyphosate. And they measured for glyphosate and they could only account for about 20% of the radio label as being glyphosate. So it's like, well, what's the rest of it? Because it started out as glyphosate. What is it now? And they found out that if they added digestive enzymes that broke the proteins down into individual amino acids, they could recover the glyphosate up to 70% of the radio label, could be accounted for as glyphosate. So basically what is the problem is you don't see the glyphosate when it's still in the protein. This is very tricky because you can get a false confidence, like if it's a milk protein and you're measuring for glyphosate, you could be fooled into thinking it doesn't have glyphosate, but it does. It's just that it's hiding inside the protein. So you have to do a proper preparation in order to see the glyphosate by breaking the protein apart into individual amino acids. And they knew that. They said that. They even proposed that perhaps it was embedded in the protein. They proposed that in that paper. Unpublished study, Monsanto study in the 1980s. I think they knew already, even then.
Well, I mean, there are lawsuits against them that they knew some of this stuff, right? And didn't.
Yes, in fact, the lawsuits won royally in part because they revealed a lot of hidden information that Monsanto was keeping from the public. I think that was a major part of the award.
Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
Sinto apogeo.
Pique ninguém.
O melhor humano.
Hey friends, thanks for tuning in to Peak Human. I'm Brian Sanders, the creator of the much anticipated Food Lies film. Things are going well with the post-production, so thank you for your continued support on Indiegogo and your patience. My guest today is Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who has been studying the effects of glyphosate for almost 10 years now. She has put together tons of science about why it's bad for you and the environment, even though it's marketed as safe. Of course, Monsanto has led you and regulators to believe this. The tricky part here is that it supposedly doesn't affect human cells, but it does affect all the billions of bacteria in your microbiome and the soil biome. She'll get into all the details in this episode, so listen on, my friend. Stephanie Seneff, PhD, is a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. Her new book, Toxic Legacy, explores the harmful effects of the herbicide glyphosate on our health and the environment. Her book is backed by shocking evidence that points a finger at glyphosate as being responsible for many debilitating chronic diseases. While at MIT, she received 4 degrees, a bachelor's degree in biophysics, as well as a master's in electrical engineering and a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science. She also has written dozens of peer-reviewed papers on the effects of drugs, nutritional deficiencies, toxic chemicals, and diet on our health. Before we jump in, I'll give you my disclosures. I take no outside funding or sponsorships for this podcast or any of my work. The only thing supporting it is my company nosetotail.org that I started well after I understood the health benefits of including quality animal foods in our diet. In other words, I have no outside interest influencing the information I present, and I'm not creating this content to sell my products. My foundational belief is that animal foods are healthy, so I connected with the best producers around the country to help people purchase them. We raise them humanely and sustainably. We don't use additives or curing agents. Everything is all natural, and we use the animal's nose to tail. We have products such as primal ground beef that includes liver, heart, kidney, and spleen for all the amazing nutrients and none of the hassle or taste you may not be used to. That's at nosetotail.org. We ship boxes straight to you and have free shipping options. We also have biltong if you want grass-finished meat on the go. This is a traditional South African meat snack that's air-dried, soft, and delicious. We have body care products made from beef tallow and only a couple other natural ingredients. We also have seasonings to go along with these wonderful products and help make cooking that much easier. Make a custom box today at nosetotail.org and take advantage of the free shipping options. That's how these interviews are all possible, along with all the other content we produce on YouTube and social media. Thanks for supporting the ranchers, my other producers, and my team. The other way you can take advantage of this win-win-win situation is at sapien.org, where we have the Sapien Tribe. It's a private members community where you get extended show notes for these podcasts, discounts on Nose to Tail products, Zoom calls with Dr. Gary and myself, and a lot more. There's also the Sapien program if you'd like some help making a lifestyle change. Go to sapien.org to find out more. Now, on to the show.
Hello, we're live with Dr. Stephanie Seneff. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Well, I'm glad to be talking to you. I got a hold of your book. I got an early copy from
awesome.
Maybe a publisher that I might work with. They sent me one, but I'm really excited to talk to you because I've read your book. It's called Toxic Legacy. I guess I can hold it up for YouTube people. And I'm also excited to talk to you because you're in Hawaii, my home state.
Yes.
You're in Kauai. How's it going over there?
It's wonderful. We're protected from all this heat. This seems to be, the whole country seems to be on fire right now. At least the northern part, northeast, northwest. Yeah, we're good here. It's really nice.
Well, you're in a special place. So, if anyone knows, I was born and raised on Oahu. She's on Kauai, even more beautiful than Oahu. So, let's jump into this, though. Let's jump into your background. You are a MIT scientist, 4 degrees from MIT. Tell us a little more.
Okay, yes, I have an undergraduate degree in biology, and I have an MS, EE, and PhD degrees in electrical engineering and computer science, the combo. And then I've been at MIT all my life, all my career. Love the place. I've got 4 boys. They all went to MIT, so very dedicated MIT family. And so I'm a senior research scientist now, which is the highest rank on the research track.
That's awesome. I have a mechanical engineering degree, so a little bit of that engineering background. I love talking to engineers, and it's very apparent you are basically a genius. I'll put that out there. Reading your book, I think I have to read it again.
There's a lot in there.
There's a lot in there, very technical, but also very kind of practical at the end. We can get into that later, but I want to talk to you about more than just glyphosate in your book. But we can start out with that. And you kind of start on your journey almost 10 years ago. Yes.
I learned about glyphosate in 2012. Yeah. So that's 9 years ago. And that was quite, I can tell that story because it's kind of interesting. Because I had 5 years before that, I had decided to start looking at autism because I was getting worried about the autism rates going up. And I was frustrated that it looked like most of the research dollars were going into genetics, so I think genetics is a component, but it's not the cause of the epidemic. So it needed to be some kind of interaction between genetics and environment. I was quite sure of that. And I was looking for things, and I looked for 5 years, and I was frustrated. I learned a lot about autism in those 5 years. I was reading everything I could about the syndrome and its properties, its comorbidities, very complicated disease. So I sort of knew what was going on with the autistic kids, but I didn't know why. And I knew they had a lot of gut issues. And then I happened to be at this conference where Professor Don Huber was speaking on glyphosate. He gave a 2-hour presentation at this conference. And I didn't know what glyphosate was. I'm embarrassed to admit this at that time. I knew about Roundup, of course, and I never used it because I don't believe in using these toxic chemicals, especially with young children. But I didn't know glyphosate. And after I heard his presentation, I walked away convinced that I had found my answer. And I was right. I mean, it was that clear. It was an epiphany because he lined up all the things that glyphosate does. And they all lined up with the things I knew were showing up in autism. It was such a perfect match. I was very confident. And that was even before I realized that autism and glyphosate, autism rates are going up exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate. There's a stunning curve that shows children in first grade diagnosed with autism in the United States, plotting that over time against the amount of glyphosate being used on the core GMO crops over time, and over the preceding 4 years. So from the age of 2 to the age of 6 in that child's life, integrated, all of that total. Perfect match, exact match between those two curves. It's a stunning correlation coefficient, 0.99 or something like that. So correlation doesn't mean causation, but, sometimes it does. And when you see that kind of correlation, you can't ignore it. You just can't. Immediately, I was like, this is just wow. I mean, first of all, believing it because of what I'd heard from the lecture. And then on top of that, finding this incredibly strong correlation. Because I'd been looking for correlations with other things. That's how I was figuring out what might be causal. But I was striking out in the sense that I couldn't explain the mechanism by which these things would cause what I was seeing with the autism. It was such a strange disease with so many interesting things going on. How could one chemical cause that? All that stuff was one of the big questions. And I, of course, was very curious about that myself. How could this chemical be so toxic? And I think I found the answer, and it was with the help of Anthony Samsel. He and I collaborated on 6 journal articles that we wrote over the course of several years. I met him right after I heard the talk from Don Huber. I met up with Anthony Samsel, and he's a really interesting character. He's a retired toxicologist, and he worked for many years in a Arthur D. Little think tank. He's now retired. He still consults on toxicology sites, but he has his own little company where he does research at his home. He has a company where he actually does hands-on research, and he's been finding all kinds of interesting things with glyphosate. And he was the one who suggested to me that it might be substituting for glycine during protein synthesis. Glycine is an amino acid. It's the smallest amino acid. It's one of the 20 building blocks of proteins. That's the DNA code. I don't know how much people know about biology. They should know this because it's very basic. But you have that 4-letter DNA code, the nucleotides that are lined up like beads on a string, and you read them off 3 at a time. And the 3 have a specific code for a particular amino acid. And then from that code, the protein is built with also beads on a string, attaching the amino acids together. That's a protein. That's called a peptide sequence, And then the protein is a whole bunch of peptide sequences put together. And each of the proteins has incredibly specific things that it does that are amazing. I mean, they're the workhorses of the body. They're enzymes and transporters and receptors, just all kinds of things that are proteins, even some hormones, So like insulin is a protein. So they're very, very important in the body. They're really central to life, and they're messed up by glyphosate through this mechanism of substituting for glycine. And if you read my book, you see that that's kind of the central story in my book.
It is, yeah. We should come back around to that glycine thing because, well, for one, I love you say that correlation doesn't mean causation, and you say it's supposed to be to form hypotheses, right? That's what you're supposed to do is you look where what's correlated, and then we get an idea, oh, maybe we should look more into that. The problem with a lot of nutrition stuff is what I'm in mainly is they stop at the correlations and then they'll make recommendations based on that. And then we see a lot of problems, which I've done 100 episodes on already. So, but
I know. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. You can get confused with it, especially with biological signaling, because you can find things that are higher under certain conditions. And you think if you can knock them down, mess up the enzymes that make that, you'll help the disease, but that doesn't turn out to be true in many cases. Homocysteine is a good example because homocysteine is elevated in the blood in association with heart disease. It's a very strong risk factor for heart disease, and they've developed drugs that can knock it down. They're so excited they can bring homocysteine levels down. Every time they try to use them, they fail miserably. They make the disease worse, So this is the and the Alzheimer's is another example, right? Amyloid beta. They're like, oh yeah, amyloid beta clearly causes Alzheimer's. Let's get rid of it. So they find these wonderful drugs, really expensive, like this new one. Mm-hmm. They get rid of the amyloid beta. They don't get rid of the Alzheimer's and make it worse usually. I mean, it's just a complete failure. And they won't just, recognize that they've got the wrong theory. It's not the right theory for what's going on. So biology's tricky.
It really is. I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to bring up the amyloid. It's a perfect story that, is how we get things wrong. I brought up on my last episode. And there is more connections with my last episode. A guy, Dr. Stephen Hussey, he actually talks about this 4th phase water stuff. And
that's big for me. I love the 4th phase of water. Yes.
Oh, we'll have to get into that. I don't. Yes. We'll tease it. We'll tease it, and we'll come back around to that stuff. But let's start in the beginning because I think people listening know to just avoid GMO foods that have glyphosate and all these monocrop stuff. But I've never done a full episode on it. So this is going to be that episode with the expert on this. And you've done, looked at all these different researchers and brought it all together into this, brought the mechanism of action with the glycine. And just to let people know, I want to talk about the shikimate pathway where I just want to say the high level view for people, because this really got stuck with me, is how Monsanto got around it is because we don't have it in our human cells. They said, oh, it's fine, it's healthy. but because it's a mechanism of action with these plants, because they have a shikimate pathway, but it's because our microbes in our body, our microbiome, they have the shikimate pathway, and they're the ones that are disrupted. So it's so obvious when you know this, that why Monsanto and all this Roundup and glyphosate has been around for years, and supposedly it's safe, but it's not. So let's jump off there.
Yes, and that's really central, because I was seeing with the autistic kids that their gut was messed up. It was very clear their gut microbiome was messed up, and that I was looking for something that would be doing. I was thinking in terms of antibiotics for ear infections. I was working with that idea. But glyphosate is a patented antimicrobial agent. They know it kills bugs. Unfortunately, it kills the good guys much more than it kills the bad guys. So you end up with lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. Those are really two really important microbes that get a good grip on the gut when the baby's born, the infant. They need those microbes to be able to digest the milk. And those microbes are very sensitive to glyphosate. And this is really crucial, because they get reduced in number, and then other microbes can grow because there's a hole. Whenever there's a vacuum, other microbes can grow. And the autistic kids have an overgrowth of Clostridia. And Clostridia are especially resistant to glyphosate. And so a very nice study showed that bifidobacteria and lactobacillus were much more sensitive than Clostridia and Salmonella. Salmonella is another one that's been causing trouble. So you end up with these toxic metabolites produced by these pathogens like Clostridia. And there are papers that have shown Clostridia overgrowth linked to autism. There was an amazing paper that involved a set of triplets, and there were 2 boys and a girl. Both boys were diagnosed with autism. The girl had a seizure disorder. All of them tested high levels of glyphosate in their urine. And the doctor who wrote the paper, it was a case study, and he observed that they had high Clostridia growth, and they had Clostridia metabolites that have been shown to be linked to autism in mouse studies. They've been shown that these Clostridia produce these metabolites that are toxins that end up disrupting the brain. They actually get into the brain and disrupt the brain and cause the autistic symptoms. So that's quite striking. It has to do with dopamine getting overstimulated dopamine, because the enzyme that breaks down the dopamine is busted by the toxins that are produced by the Clostridia. So there's all these complicated things that happen in biology to cause disease. It's an amazingly complex story. And I tried to simplify some things in my book. You can't imagine how many papers I read on the gut to write that chapter on the gut, which I was really finally very happy with. But I had to go through several iterations of rewrite to kind of get the essence of the story, connected to the glyphosate. And it's an amazing story, and it shows that glyphosate disrupts the pH of the gut. It makes it pH too high, which ends up disrupting the balance of these metabolites that are produced by the gut microbe, which are these small fatty acids, short chain fatty acids. There's 3 of them that are really important: butyrate, propionate, and acetate. And what's been shown in studies is that in the presence of glyphosate, acetate goes down, and butyrate depends upon, and the pH goes up, and butyrate depends on low pH. So you end up with too little butyrate, too little butyrate, and too much acetate. Acetate goes up, butyrate goes down. And propionate in particular goes way up. And propionate is the one that's hooked to autism, the middle one. So it's really fascinating. Just this simple thing of these little fatty acids, you can't imagine that it could be so important. It's a 1 chain, 2 chain, and 3 chain. They're very short fatty acids, super important. They're made by the gut microbes. And the butyrate is the fuel for the colonocytes that line the gut barrier. So when there's not enough butyrate, the colonocytes get sick, you get a leaky barrier, and then you get all kinds of problems. And on top of that, it messes up the digestion of the proteins, because that depends upon those bacteria that are getting killed off. The lactobacillus and the bifidobacteria help the host to digest milk. So when the infant is nursing, it gets these complicated milk proteins. These bacteria have specialized enzymes that we don't have. There's so much that the gut microbes have in the way of extra enzymes that are not in the human host. They make all these B vitamins as well, and these come out of that shikimate pathway. And the products of the shikimate pathway itself are the aromatic amino acids, which are essential for the proteins. Those are 3 of those coding amino acids. So those get reduced because the microbes that make them, the pathway they used to make them is getting wrecked by glyphosate. That's that shikimate pathway. So critical metabolites that are normally produced by the microbes are insufficient. They're deficient. And critical other metabolites that are produced by the pathogens are toxic. So you get this awful mess of the gut being all messed up. And these kids have bloating, they have diarrhea, they have constipation, all these symptoms evident of gut dysbiosis in the autistic kids. Well known, well established. And it's really just that the glyphosate is messing everything up.
So So it's beyond autism, though. We're talking a lot about autism,
Yes.
but you talk about in the book all the different things that glyphosate, all the problems that it can lead to. So I'll throw that out there, and we'll get to them. But also, I just want to know how much of disease do you think starts in the gut? Because it seems like a
I
lot.
know. It's amazing, isn't it? And
Yeah.
the other thing I noticed is I just looked at the number of papers that were published on the microbiome over time, and there's been a huge increase over the past 20 years. It almost matches the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops. So basically, as our microbiome got disturbed, we got interested in studying it. Before that, it was like, everything's fine. We don't need to study this. You know, we're kind of like, oh, yeah, those gut microbes, they're doing something that's fine, whatever. You know, we didn't care. We didn't need to know that. But now that we see all these problems, they're doing a lot of amazing papers. And these papers are often incredibly difficult. Like, they've got huge amounts of data with these beautiful charts with all these colors, and your eyes glaze over. It's a very difficult space because there are so many of them, and they're so different from person to person. Everybody has their unique gut microbiome. And they're helping you out. And often I think the microbes are growing to help to compensate for what else is going on. They're trying to adjust to the situation to optimize the health of the host, but they have a hard time doing that when they're being poisoned by glyphosate, basically.
So what do you think are the biggest factors? So glyphosate is a huge factor, just processed foods. Like, what other these factors that in the last 20 years really ruined our gut?
Yes, well, the processed foods, of course, are also an issue. And I think that, they think of, when they make these processed foods, they're basically thinking of fats, proteins, and carbs, right? Fats, proteins, and carbs. And what they're leaving out are all these complicated molecules that are produced by plants. You have, if you take herbs and spices and even just, regular plants, they produce these very interesting polyphenolic compounds, things that are called polyphenols or flavonoids or terpenoids. These are very beneficial antioxidant molecules that are quite complicated. They're beautiful looking with lots of circles and stuff. They're amazingly complex, these molecules and there's an enormous number of them. That's another space that's hard to get a handle on if you try to read the literature. There's just so many of them, but they're all and they have different things that they can do. They've actually been developing treatments for COVID-19 based on these compounds that are produced by plants. And so eating a lot of herbs and spices is a really good idea, because then you're getting all of these complicated molecules. When they make a soy protein bar, there's none of them in there. They're gone. It's just a simple nutrient. So they're not thinking in terms of all these molecules that are really beneficial to our health in ways that we didn't appreciate. And chlorophyll is another one. Chlorophyll is the one that, is the green in the plants that allows them to capture the energy in sunlight to turn carbon dioxide into organic matter. Really, really important. Chlorophyll is the enzyme that helps them to do that. And chlorophyll actually you can eat chlorophyll and your cells can make use of it to help with the mitochondria. It's quite extraordinary. I found a paper on that. I mean, it's just, we don't realize all these things that are in our natural foods that are stripped out when we make these processed foods. Whoa. And so when we eat only processed foods, those things become deficient.
Yeah, I talked to amazing researcher, Dr. Stefan von Vliet, who looks at all these phenolic compounds, flavonoids, and even in meat, where if the animal's grass-fed, all of these secondary compounds make it into the meat, and he uses mass spectrometry and looks at it all, and it's really amazing. And I am a big fan of like eating herbs and spices with my foods and
It's totally important. It's delicious too. So you're spicing it up for your own taste as well as enriching your health. So very important to eat these natural foods, and especially spicy foods that add flavor.
I love that. And okay, so we were talking about different factors and how our guts got messed up. So glyphosate, processed foods, like eating foods not in their whole form, you mess with nature, you have consequences.
Right. Now well, just the micronutrient deficiencies that you get when you're eating foods that are impoverished in micronutrients. And a lot of these, like flour and sugar, right? There's no micronutrients in there. Those are so basic foods that have lost all of their nutritional value. In fact, they put things back into the flour. They
try.
So they add things back that are probably bad, like the folate. The folic acid that they require in the flour. Bad idea, because it's not the natural form of folate that you really need. Folic acid doesn't work.
Same
but
thing
they
with
think,
iron.
we just put that in.
Iron too. Iron. They try to iron. Yeah, they add it back in. And it's not good.
It's not the right form, because you have really the natural form in which iron is able to be handled correctly. In fact, heme iron, from the meats is so different from just the iron that's added, added back into the foods. They think they can just put vitamins back in. Look at the cereal box and it has all these vitamins supplemented to 100% of the daily requirement of all of these vitamins. That's not real. I mean, it's just they put those back in. It's heavily processed. It's not natural. And so, so I think also another one is sunlight and vitamin D. We have a massive deficiency of vitamin D in this country right now. Huge numbers of people are popping vitamin D pills in large numbers. It's become very much of a fad, I think, to just take tons of vitamin D. I think it's way overdone. But the problem is we're not getting out in the sun. So I really am a big fan of the sunlight. And I encourage people to get out in the sunlight without sunscreen, without even sunglasses. And I'm a good example of that because I never wear sunglasses. And I'm 73 years old. My eyes are great. I don't even need glasses. I don't even wear glasses.
That's great.
So
Can you go into
pretty amazing.
Yeah, I've heard about this before where if you wear sunglasses, your body doesn't get the signal that it's about to get a lot of sun. Is that how it goes?
Yeah, I think the sunglasses, I mean, you think that we evolved on an earth that had the sun there all the time, right? The sun was there and we took advantage of it as a useful source of energy. And I think people don't realize to what extent we're able to utilize the energy in the sun for very good purposes. It catalyzes enzymes that do very important things. And I've talked about it in my book, but one of the things I believe is happening is that when you get sunlight exposure to the eyes, it's reaching the pineal gland, which is right behind the eyes. And the pineal gland is a very interesting gland. It's called the seat of the soul. It's very mystical. And it's the one that controls sleep. It makes the melatonin, that helps you sleep. And we've got an epidemic of sleep disorder as well. But the pineal gland responds to sunlight. So if you get sunlight in the morning, the pineal gland starts making sulfate. It makes sulfate in response to sunlight. And then it uses that sulfate at night and hooks it onto the melatonin molecules that it ships out into the cerebral spinal fluid. So it's making melatonin sulfate and putting it into the cerebral spinal fluid that's supplying the brain with sulfate as well as with melatonin. And those are both really critical to help the brain clear cellular debris, which is what you do while you're sleeping. So it really helps you sleep, but it also helps you keep your brain healthy because you could clear those amyloid beta plaques if you had enough melatonin sulfate. And
just going on the sun will produce cholesterol sulfate.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the critical one. Cholesterol sulfate is what I write a lot about in my papers. I believe it's a very important molecule, and I believe it is derailed by glyphosate because the enzyme that makes the sulfate is called, I write about this in my book. There's an enzyme called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which makes nitric oxide. But I believe it also makes sulfur dioxide. It's a moonlighting enzyme, it's called. It makes two things, and it depends on where it is and circumstances as to which one it makes. It's a kind of a yin and a yang. And those two actually work together to keep the blood circulation at the right viscosity level. It's really fascinating science. And it relates to the fourth phase of water because the sulfate structures the water and makes the gel that lines the blood vessels, and that allows the red blood cells to slip through the capillaries with very little friction. So really important to have the sulfate. In fact, it's cholesterol sulfate that's produced in the skin in response to sunlight. And then the cholesterol sulfate is released into the blood, and it can travel freely in the blood. It doesn't have to be packaged up inside an LDL particle. So when you're not making enough cholesterol sulfate, your liver is compelled to release more LDL particles, and your LDL goes up. And that's the one that gets you on a statin drug. So I think the high cholesterol is a consequence of low cholesterol sulfate.
That's a different angle. Yeah, because my community knows that if you're eating a good diet and this LDL isn't what we think, but there's more context there, right? And you're talking about some of that context where LDL, it depends on other things than just having high LDL.
Right, and of course, oxidized LDL is the thing that's damaging. Oxidized LDL is what will cause you to end up with cholesterol accumulating in the arteries that supply the heart. And I have some very interesting theories about that as well. That has to do with your heart is actually squirreling away cholesterol in its arteries because it desperately needs cholesterol. It's waiting for sulfate in order to get the cholesterol delivered, and the sulfate gets delivered at the same time. So both the cholesterol and the sulfate are supporting each other to help them travel through the blood. Neither one of them does a good job of traveling through the blood without the other. You put them together and they have a much easier time to get around, which allows them to be distributed throughout your body. And when they arrive at a destination, they break apart, and the sulfate goes into the extracellular matrix, and the cholesterol goes into the membrane, and the cell is very happy to receive both of them. Cholesterol is not a toxin. It is an essential nutrient. It's vital to health, and it's only found in animals. Plants don't have cholesterol, which is interesting. It's an animal-based essential molecule, and it's really what gives us, I think, a brain, and it gives us mobility. It's essential for the muscles in the brain in particular.
Well, and I think immune system too. I think that there's a lot
Yes,
of
absolutely. Absolutely. And the sulfate as well for the immune system. And I think that's one of the reasons why glyphosate derails the innate immune system is because it disrupts heparin sulfate. I write a lot about heparin sulfate in my book. Very, very interesting molecule that lines all the blood vessels and makes the blood healthy. And the sulfation, the degree of sulfation of the heparin sulfate has a tremendous influence on what happens in the blood. So you need to have a lot of sulfate to make the blood healthy. And that's also involved in the metabolism of a broken molecule. So when molecules get damaged by sugar or by oxygen, they need to be removed and degraded and then turned into something useful that can start over again, building blocks, And this happens in the lysosomes, and the lysosomes depend upon heparin sulfate for that to work. So when the heparin sulfate is deficient, it's hard for the cells to recycle debris. So the debris piles up. And something like amyloid beta is a really big debris molecule that you want to get rid of in Alzheimer's. And if you can't, because you don't have enough sulfate, you're going to get Alzheimer's.
Yes, and what you're talking about is glycation and oxidation, and yeah, that's a problem. Cholesterol is a good thing; it's a necessary thing for our body. But when it gets oxidized or glycated, this is when the problems occur. And maybe I guess now you could go into the fourth phase water. That stuff we started talking about the arteries and how it lines the arteries.
Yes, and it's so interesting because it gets glycated and oxidized because of this inability to supply enough sulfate. You need the reactive oxygen species to make the sulfate, and they damage the LDL. And the LDL can be packaged up inside an LDL particle safely if there's enough sulfate to surround it. So you actually cholesterol sulfate is in the membrane of the LDL particle, and the sulfate makes the gelled water around it. And the gelled water is like a shield that keeps glycation damage away. So the LDL particle becomes healthy if it's got enough sulfate, enough cholesterol sulfate in particular, in its membrane. The cholesterol sulfate goes into the membrane, puts the sulfate out into the water, into the blood, and it makes this nice gelled water shield that's called exclusion zone water, because nothing can get in. And that's beautiful because then you can't get the damage. It's safe. So without the sulfate, it's not safe. It gets oxidized, it gets glycated, it gets damaged, it goes into the artery wall to cause heart disease. And that's because of insufficient sulfate. I think sulfate deficiency is a primary driver behind heart disease.
Absolutely. So then how do people prevent that? We're talking about what their diet and lifestyle would be to prevent that. So getting sun without sunscreen.
Yep, without sunscreen, without sunglasses, because you can help your brain, sulfate supply in your brain by having sun exposure to your eyes. I think it's very important. I feel very upset when I see a little 2-year-old wearing sunglasses. I want to rip them off his face, but I don't say anything, because I'm feeling too polite. But I wish the mother would know that she's doing a bad thing, I think, to protect the 2-year-old from the sun, sun exposure to the eyes.
Well, yeah. And just with the sunscreen too, I was lathered in sunscreen, but I mean, I'm not saying go get burnt, right? I go in the sun in a responsible way. And yeah, you have to get out.
And if you pick up a tan, I mean, I certainly as a kid, I never used sunscreen, and I always was outside a lot, and I got a lot of sun in the spring, and I got a tan. By the time the summer sun came along, the tan protected me. I mean, a tan is a really good protection against burning. But you never get a tan if you're always wearing sunscreen. So the minute you forgot your sunscreen, you're in trouble, right? You're on the boat, it's the bright sun, you have no sunscreen, and you've been protecting yourself all the while, so your skin is white. Now you're in really big trouble. But you need to just build up your own resistance during the periods when the sun isn't as strong, so you can handle the summer sun. And I'm not saying go out and burn yourself, of course, but just to get, certainly if you take a walk in the morning in the bright sunlight for an hour or 45 minutes, that's a good start,
Absolutely. Well, I talk about having a dog, how great it is to have a dog. I get out there, I get my sun, I'm not wearing sunglasses, I'm walking, I'm getting microbiome, I'm getting dirt, all kinds of little bits of, dirt and whatever. And that's a good start. And then I just finished reading your book out in the sun. I do that during the good hours, 10 to 2, get those, and I do that for a limited time and I build up to it. And you work on it in the spring, and now in the summer, I can handle it.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And we've just become obsessed. And in fact, skin cancer, melanoma skin cancer has been going up over time, exactly in step with the rise in the use of sunscreen. We're getting stronger and stronger, levels of sunscreen with these sun protection factors of like 65, right? When I was a kid, it was like 8 was high, we had like maybe 4 and 8, and now it's like 65. I mean, it's just crazy, the degree of sun protection they're offering. And they've got aluminum in them, which is really toxic. It's going to absorb through the skin. It's going to mess up, actually. The enzyme enos gets messed up by aluminum. So when you put aluminum-based sunscreen on the skin, you're messing up the enzymes that would make the cholesterol sulfate. So you're really screwing things up with the sunscreen.
Yeah. And it's sort of this false protection where you think you're blocking it and maybe you don't get sunburn, but you're still getting some of these UVB. Or UVA. I don't remember which one.
Yeah, I know. I get them mixed up too. I'm sorry. I should know. At one time I did know, but I'm not going to be able to tell you now. But it is true that the sunscreen can deceive you into thinking that you're not burning, and so you stay out too long, right? Because you think I'm fine. And you don't look like you're burning. You don't get the signals because the sunscreen is blocking them. And I think that may be one way in which the UV becomes more dangerous, because it's really kind of surprising that that we're not solving the problem that the sunscreen is supposed to solve, which is to prevent this cancer, right? The whole point of the sunscreen is to prevent melanoma. And it's doing the opposite. I mean, people should know that. It's doing the opposite. The literature tells you that. And it's just crazy to use sunscreen.
I think so. And it sounds really wacky. And I've heard in the mainstream people attack people like you or me for talking about this. And they're like, these wacky people, they're conspiracy people.
Yeah,
or,
I know. It's so hard for them.
Yeah.
It's hard for people to believe some of the things I know that we say, which is really unfortunate that the pharma has gotten it all so wrong. I just feel like there's almost nothing they're getting right, and all their drugs, all the drugs that they're using to treat depression and anxiety, they're causing all kinds of horrendous symptoms in the people who are taking them. And of course, the opioid drugs that are causing addiction and just huge problems with the prescription drugs. I think pharma's in a really bad place, I feel.
Well, you're speaking to the choir. I think everyone listening knows that it's almost the opposite of what they say. So
it's so amazing, isn't it? I don't know how they could have gotten it so wrong. It's just quite fascinating that they've managed to get so many things completely wrong. In the food industry too, of course, because they're pushing the processed foods, which is also crazy. Well, what they're telling you is okay to eat, and what isn't okay is exactly wrong as well. Like the high-fat diet. I never went on a low-fat diet. I ignored that whole thing. In fact, I would refuse to buy anything forever in my life. If I saw something in the grocery store that claimed to be low-fat, non-fat, fat-free, I wouldn't buy it.
Good. That's a good rule of thumb.
I never approved of that.
I think if any marketing says it's healthy, it's almost the opposite. If it has a heart healthy sticker on it, I run away.
I know. Cheerios heart healthy, and they're loaded with glyphosate. So.
Oh man. All right. We should get back on the glyphosate train. So we left off kind of talking about the shikimate pathway. Maybe you could go in a little more on that.
Yes, well, the shikimate pathway is not found in human cells. That's correct. And that was the big deal that Monsanto advertised to say this chemical is wonderful because we don't have the pathway. It's a particular enzyme in the pathway that they've singled out as being especially sensitive to glyphosate, which is called EPSP synthase. And that's a critical enzyme in the pathway. When that's broken, lots of things go south. And the plants absolutely depend on that pathway, in part to make all those beautiful polyphenolic compounds that I mentioned earlier. Those things come out of the shikimate pathway. It makes that basic benzene ring that is central to so much of biology. And the output of the shikimate pathway, these aromatic amino acids, those are precursors to a whole bunch of hormones like serotonin, melatonin, melanin, the skin tanning agent. So that's another thing. If melanin is deficient, then you're going to be more sensitive to the sun. And so glyphosate is going to make melanin deficient by virtue of blocking that pathway that provides the precursors to make the melanin. So the melanin, melatonin, serotonin, dopamine, and epinephrine, which is adrenaline, all of those basic hormones, they all come out of the shikimate pathway, as well as thyroid hormone. So we have a lot of issues with the thyroid that I think is also connected to this disruption of the shikimate pathway, and certain B vitamins. So niacin and riboflavin come out of the shikimate pathway, and also vitamin K2. So these are all going to be affected by the disruption of the shikimate pathway in the gut microbiome, which is providing us with these B vitamins. I mean, again, I don't think we realized how much we were depending upon them. We think of the nutrients coming from the food, which is true. And of course, it's also going to be depleted in the foods that are exposed to glyphosate. So we're getting less from the food, but we're also getting less from the microbes. And the microbes are really a major player in supplying us with these critical nutrients. We hadn't appreciated that until we found out that they were broken. And then we started to see these diseases appearing that are connected to deficiencies in these things that the gut's microbiome used to supply and isn't supplying adequately anymore.
Yeah, the B vitamins specifically, it sounds like.
Yes, the B vitamins and vitamin K2 and all those hormones. And of course, those aromatic amino acids, which are coating part of the protein. So if you don't have a deficiency in aromatic amino acids that are needed for a particular protein, you can't make that protein. So that's another problem, sort of impaired protein synthesis.
Well, so this is crazy. So glyphosate is ruining all the things you're talking about on these pathways, all the gut microbiome, the different vitamins. It's ruining the soil, which we can get into too. So the whole pharmaceutical industry.
And then the minerals is another one.
Yeah, we got to
talk about.
We got to get into that. But I was just thinking about our whole plan is so funny. It's not funny. It's sad that we have our modern sort of things like glyphosate or modern foods with the processed foods, and they create all the problems, and then the pharmaceutical industry just tries to solve them and patch it, but it doesn't work. It's like, it's so simple when you eat the bad foods, the processed foods and glyphosate foods, you come up with all these problems, and then you try to take the pharmaceuticals to prevent it. Or you just skip eating the glyphosate soaked foods and the processed foods, then you don't need the solutions, these fake solutions from big pharma.
Right. And, women have a real problem these days with pelvic pain. There's a lot of women who are suffering from bladder issues and fibroids, like the uterus is overproducing these extra uterine materials, endometriosis, all these and reproductive issues, all these things. I think they're being caused by glyphosate, and there's increasing numbers of women are complaining about this kind of pain in the pelvis. And sometimes they take out the uterus and the pain doesn't go away. Then they realize it's actually the bladder. I mean, it's like those organs, their membranes are also get leaky, just like the gut gets leaky. So glyphosate causes a leaky gut barrier, but it also causes leaky barriers in both the uterus and in the bladder to cause health issues there that can be very painful. So there's all these weird problems that women are complaining about, and the doctors don't understand where it's coming from. It's a mysterious disease, and they don't know how to treat it. And the women are suffering greatly, and they're not getting treated. Then they don't know how to fix it. And the way to fix it is to switch to an organic diet. And there's actually testimony from someone. There was a guy who contacted me a few years back, said his wife was suffering from this pain, cystitis, interstitial cystitis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of that? Interstitial cystitis, a lot of pain, and she just couldn't fix it. And then I told him, put her on an organic diet, and he got back to me a year later, said it totally worked. It was a miracle. And then he wrote a whole article that's on the web, and he even talks about having talked to me and how I'd helped him out. Mm-hmm. So it's he has an article where he talks about this. My wife, and she was really, her problems were completely fixed by just going to an organic diet.
Yeah, it's interesting to me to think about. I always think about the root cause of the problems, and a lot of people in my community, I'm in the ancestral health community, right? And we're eating, natural foods, and more meat and fish and eggs, and some like just good organic foods. I'm wondering if a lot of the benefits people are getting is from getting less glyphosate.
I've wondered that myself, and I think that may be true, because obviously animals are one step away from plants, right? The plants are getting the glyphosate directly, and the animals are getting it indirectly. And if you're eating grass-fed beef, it's probably going to be very low in glyphosate. You hope that the grass is not being exposed to glyphosate. So, yes, I think it's true that when you eat a more of an animal-based diet, you end up with less exposure to glyphosate. So, in fact, some of the highest levels, I wanted to mention this too about the GMOs, because people think, oh yeah, non-GMO, that's good. And that is not necessarily true, because some of the highest levels of glyphosate were found in non-GMO foods. The GMO foods are resistant to glyphosate, but many of the non-GMO foods are sprayed with glyphosate right before harvest as a desiccant to kill the plant. The intent is to kill the plant, make it go to seed, increase the yield, maybe chasing a frost, trying to beat the frost. So there's maybe compelling reasons to do it, but they end up with lots of glyphosate in the food. And that's why we have an epidemic in celiac disease, because wheat is one of those foods that's sprayed right before harvest as a desiccant.
This was really surprising to me. And that even non-GMO foods, and especially you're saying up north, if the growing season is short and the frost is coming, then they have to spray it to make it seed right quickly.
Right, before it gets killed by the frost. So I mean, that's a compelling reason, really. If you're going to lose your crop because it's going to freeze, you could be inspired to do it. But it's a really bad idea because you end up with glyphosate in the food, and that's what's causing the celiac disease. And I've written a whole paper on celiac disease together with Anthony Samsel on glyphosate and celiac disease. I really believe it's the primary cause of the epidemic.
So
not the only thing
gluten
that causes the disease, but
So like more than gluten.
Yeah, well, it is gluten, but the gluten is contaminated with glyphosate, and also the microbes that break down the gluten, the same ones that break down the milk, the casein in milk, they also break down the gluten. They have these specialized enzymes that deal with this proline. Proline is a very difficult amino acid to break apart from the chain, and the lactobacillus have these specialized enzymes that break it apart. So the lactobacillus gets killed off by glyphosate, and then the enzymes aren't sufficient to break down the protein, so the proteins stick around, and they don't get digested. And you have the leaky gut that glyphosate also sets up. So the proteins get out into circulation, and the immune cells get really angry when they see these wayward gluten proteins in the wrong place. They develop antibodies, and then those antibodies attack your own tissues through something called molecular mimicry. So you end up attacking certain enzymes that cause you to have the symptoms of gluten intolerance and celiac disease.
Wow. So yeah, well, it's both. So I know, we're kind of in the Weston Price world, I guess you'd say. We're fans of Weston Price and his teaching.
Yes.
So they talk about proper preparation techniques, and if you have the right wheat and it's organic and you ferment it and you do this type of stuff. So are you on that kind of line of thinking that if you do it correctly, that people can have gluten and not have a problem?
Well, I think if you could avoid glyphosate, people could have gluten and not have a problem. Basically, it's a matter of getting rid of glyphosate. And if you've been eating glyphosate-contaminated food for a long time, it's accumulated in your body, so it's going to be difficult to get rid of it. It's not easy to get rid of it once it's there, unfortunately.
That's part of the story. It sticks around for a long time. And the Monsanto's trying to say it goes away in like a month.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they say 2 weeks, it would just go right through the urine, leave it through the urine in 2 weeks. And unfortunately, some of it sticks around. And the Monsanto knows that because their own studies found they exposed animals. There's a particular one on bluegill sunfish where Anthony and I have talked about that in one of our papers. And I think I've talked about it in the book as well. This was back in the 1980s. They exposed bluegill sunfish to radio-labeled glyphosate so they could track the radio label. And then they looked at the tissues, and they looked for radio label in the tissues, and they found it in lots of tissues. And then they said, well, let's see if there's glyphosate. And they measured for glyphosate, and they could only account for about 20% of the radio label as being glyphosate. So it's like, well, what's the rest of it? Because it started out as glyphosate. What is it now? And they found out that if they added digestive enzymes that broke the proteins down into individual amino acids, they could recover the glyphosate up to 70% of the radio label, could be accounted for as glyphosate. So basically what is the problem is you don't see the glyphosate when it's still in the protein. This is very tricky because you can get a false confidence, like if it's a milk protein and you're measuring for glyphosate, you could be fooled into thinking it doesn't have glyphosate, but it does. It's just that it's hiding inside the protein. So you have to do a proper preparation in order to see the glyphosate by breaking the protein apart into individual amino acids. And they knew that. They said that. They even proposed that perhaps it was embedded in the protein. They proposed that in that paper. Unpublished study, Monsanto study in the 1980s. I think they knew already, even then.
Well, I mean, there are lawsuits against them that they knew some of this stuff, right? And didn't. Yes,
in fact, the lawsuits won royally in part because they revealed a lot of hidden information that Monsanto was keeping from the public. I think that was a major part of the award for these early lawsuits. So there were these 3 lawsuits that on non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that one after the other won large awards with a jury trial. That was so exciting. I was really, really thrilled during that period. And there's another bit of good news with respect to countries banning glyphosate. I've been watching that as well. Bermuda banned it, I think, in 2016. And Europe, many countries in Europe are rumbling about banning it. Austria tried to ban it. And then it looked like they were going to, and then it fell apart, having something to do with, legal process by which they screwed something up with respect to the European Union, that they were not obeying policy of the European Union. So you have a lot of this higher up level organizations wielding power over lower levels so that the country can't even do it because the union says no. I mean, there's that kind of thing that they play these games of trying to get control of the top and then disenfranchise the bottom, so that even in Hawaii, for example, many counties have had issues with these toxic chemicals where they've had certain bills that they even pass those bills, put them into law, and then the Hawaii government says, no, you can't do that. So Hawaii is not allowed to protect its own citizens from the damage that's being caused by the chemical industry that's spilling these toxic chemicals all over the agricultural fields. Very frustrating.
This is why I hate all the politics and all this layer of bureaucracy. It always screws things up. But also in Russia, they banned it a long time ago.
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, they don't allow GMOs. They're very strict about GMOs, I think. And I don't know that they've banned glyphosate, but they use them enormously less. And they have many of these small family farms. They're much better positioned to go completely certified organic. And I think Putin is encouraging that. I think he really understands that he wants Russia to be the organic food capital of the world. He's talked about that, which is interesting, to think that our so-called enemy is doing something right where we're doing it wrong. And Mexico I'm so happy that Mexico decided they were going to phase it out. I think 2024, they're going to completely phase out glyphosate. U.S. is very unhappy about this. U.S. government is pressuring them like crazy, as well as Monsanto pressuring them to not do it, trying to warn them that there are going to be all kinds of dire consequences. I mean, we push our muscle around to keep countries from doing something decent like banning glyphosate. This makes me really, really angry at my government. So far, I think Mexico has held firm, but it's kind of hard to know where that's going. So far, they're still saying we're going to ban it by 2024. And I really hope that happens. And the U.S. is nervous that Monsanto is going to start banning imports from us because our foods are contaminated with glyphosate. And I certainly hope they do that, because I think if we can get our neighbors to show us that they won't eat our food, then maybe we can wake up a little bit and realize that we're poisoning our own population.
That would be amazing. That'd be amazing. And yeah, Russia, I mean, since 2015, I think Putin said that, or you said that in the book, 2015. And then also, I find it interesting in Europe, a lot of people are like, oh, hey, how come I can eat the bread in Europe and I don't feel so bad? Or all these type of things, or, oh, how come the French, eat a lot of bread, but they're okay? And I think they just use less glyphosate.
They do. That's right. Yeah. In fact, Canada did a big, they tested over 8,000 different food samples. My friend Tony Mitra he pressured his government. He's a Canadian, and he pressured their government to finally get them to test over 8,000 samples. And he got all the data and published it in a book called Poison Foods of North America, where he has all this evidence of United States and Canada having significantly much higher levels of glyphosate in their foods than either Europe or, in particular, Mexico. I was quite struck by very big difference. Mexico really lined up with Europe. So if you can't find organic, buy it from Mexico, which is kind of sad to say, because you usually think the Mexican food might be, subpar, right? But they're doing a better job.
Yeah,
they're doing a better job than we are on the glyphosate.
Well, that's sad. What do you think the COVID connection? I know you're looking into glyphosate and just worsening outcomes with COVID.
Right, I really believe so. In fact, it's quite interesting to look around the world, and I've been kind of looking at different countries around the world and looking for correlations between the amount of glyphosate they use and the amount of number of COVID deaths per population. There's actually tremendous differences among different countries in terms of the per population death from COVID. And U.S. is very high. We're really one of the top level. Brazil is another one. United States and Brazil have by more deaths total than any other country, but also more deaths per population. Both doing very badly, both heavily invested in glyphosate and both heavily invested in biofuels. And I think the biofuel connection is extremely interesting. And I recognized that early on when I saw the pattern with Wuhan and then northern Italy in the Lombardy region of northern Italy, and then New York City. There was that boom, boom, boom pattern that we saw with this hospitals overfilling with people whose lungs were getting incapacitated by this disease, and it terrified everybody. And all three of those are places where you have the glyphosate and you have the biofuels. So, Europe has been really big on biodiesel. They use much more biodiesel in their vehicles than we do. And the biodiesel is often imported from Argentina, and it's made from GMO Roundup Ready soy. So I think they're getting glyphosate in their fuel, and then it's evaporating into the air before it reaches combustion. And so I believe, and in fact, Brazil kind of confirmed that, or at least it was highly suggestive. There was a recent paper published from some Brazilian researchers And they found glyphosate in the nanoparticles in the air. And they looked in the agricultural regions where the glyphosate was being used. And they looked in the city. And they found that the levels in the city were higher than the levels in the agricultural regions where the glyphosate was being used. Quite astonishing.
Wow.
But Brazil is a leader in bioethanol, and they make the bioethanol from sugarcane. The sugarcane is sprayed right before harvest with glyphosate. So I think they're getting bioethanol releasing, evaporating glyphosate, getting into those nanoparticles, and then you're breathing them in, and then the glyphosate is ruining your immune system in your lungs so that when the virus comes in, you can't fight it off. And then you get this cytokine storm because your adaptive immune system gets on fire and overreacts to the virus because it can't clear it. And it can't clear it because of the effect of glyphosate. And I have a whole chapter in my book explaining how I think glyphosate is disrupting innate immunity and making it weak. So I think most people in the United States have a deficient immune system, defective immune system. And this is why we're much more sensitive. In fact, it's quite interesting in America that you saw the agricultural areas like North Dakota, and Nevada. I think those states, they didn't hit, the first wave didn't really hit them at all of COVID last year. But it wasn't until fall, like October, that all of a sudden they got this big surge. All these agricultural states that are growing foods that are sprayed with glyphosate right before harvest. So they're spraying the glyphosate in the fields. And I think that's setting them up to be susceptible to COVID-19.
Oh, wow. And there's also, well, if we're talking about these correlations with Wuhan, New York, Italy, northern Italy, there's also just really poor air quality and low vitamin D. So I don't know what you think about those.
Yeah, low vitamin D is clearly connected. A lot of papers have come out. One of them claimed that they thought 90% of the deaths could be caused by vitamin D deficiency. We're certainly linked to vitamin D deficiency. So most of the people who died had vitamin D deficiency. And so I think vitamin D is absolutely crucial. And of course, vitamin D is really important for the immune system. So that makes sense because that's part of the weak immune system is the disruption of vitamin D. And in fact, glyphosate disrupts enzymes in the liver that are called cytochrome P450 enzymes. Those enzymes are super important in the liver for many things. One of them is to detoxify other toxic chemicals. Another one is to make bile acids. But a third one is to activate vitamin D. So when you have these cytochrome P450 enzymes disrupted by glyphosate, the vitamin D that's made can't be activated. And so you're deficient even though you may have enough. It's just not getting turned into the active form.
I know people that get on the sun and do all these things, but still have low vitamin D levels. And I think, and other people have told me too, it's because of glyphosate is causing this problem. It's not going through like it should.
Yeah, I think that's true. Glyphosate messes up so many enzymes, and I talk about it in my book, but it's astonishing how many, and some that have been shown to be disrupted in experiments, as well as fitting my model. And I discuss in my book the specific sort of glyphosate susceptibility, pattern that these enzymes have. That's a common thread among the enzymes that are especially hit hard by glyphosate. And one of them is one called PEPCK, phosphoenolpyruvate carboxykinase. And I talk quite a bit about that enzyme in my book. And I can explain how that would cause a lot of problems that we're seeing, like fatty liver disease, obesity, even some crises in children that are born and they end up sudden infant death syndrome from a crisis of low blood sugar can all be caused by this disruption of PEPCK.
You have to get the book. I think people just need to read the book. If you want to get into all these details, there's so much science going on in this book, and you can go into all of these rabbit holes. But I want to go back to the innate immune system and just immune health in general. If you want to just get into that more, because I think you kind of, yeah.
Well, I talked about in my book, my theory that glyphosate is disrupting the immune system's ability to trap the viruses. So it's quite interesting because this relates to the protein collagen. Collagen is the most common protein in the body. There's like 25% of our proteins are collagen molecules. And collagen has this long sequence of GXY, where every third amino acid is a glycine. So it has tremendous potential for susceptibility to glyphosate disruption by substituting for those glycines. Collagen makes this beautiful structure, triple helix structure that gives it its special properties of tensile strength and ability to absorb water. And, it's a very critical protein in your joints. But if it gets disrupted by glyphosate, it's going to cause a lot of joint problems. And so we have all these back pain, knee replacement surgery, hip replacement surgery, all these different problems of our joints. But the immune system also depends upon these collagen-like sequences. They're called stalks. that are in these specialized immune cells, and there's several immune proteins. And there's several of these different proteins in this class that have this collagen-like stalk. And that collagen-like stalk is very, very important for those proteins to be able to trap and clear viruses. So when that gets disrupted by glyphosate, those proteins probably don't even get out into the surface. And actually that's seen in association with this, in the lungs, they see that in association with this vaping problem, the vaping disease that is associated with a lung disease that looks a whole lot like COVID-19 in terms of its symptom that these vaping people are getting. And I think that may be caused by glyphosate in the vaping source from the glycerol in the vaping fluids that is getting into the lungs and messing up these stalks. And they actually showed in an experiment on mice that they had a deficiency in these proteins that are with these collagen-based stalks. They had a deficiency in those. Those are surfactant proteins in the lung that help to trap the viruses. They were not being released into the surface of the protein of the cell, so they couldn't trap the virus. So then the virus is able to multiply freely and get overabundant, and then you've got, they call them the alarm bells, the adaptive immune system. All these cells come in, immune cells come in and swarm in the lungs and release all these cytokines, which are sort of toxic molecules like shooting guns. They're shooting guns wildly trying to kill the viruses because they can't trap them. And they're shooting guns at themselves too and injuring the tissue. So eventually the lung tissue becomes so injured that you can't breathe and you start to get oxygen issues.
Well, so back to the glycine. So people may know that collagen is made up of glycine, right? Glycine is something you get when you eat animal's nose to tail. Well, my company's called Nose to Tail. I'm into nose to tail eating, right? You eat the bone broth and you eat, right? This is why you want to eat the collagenous parts and all the gristle and bits and pieces of the animal, is you get a lot of this glycine. But the thing is with glyphosate is it looks very similar. It's very similar chemically in structure to glycine.
It is a glycine molecule. It's a complete glycine molecule, except it's missing one proton. And that proton is replaced with this extra thing called a methylphosphonate. So it has a bulky thing stuck on in place of one proton, which makes it behave very differently, but it matches perfectly to the spot to fit into the place to fool the enzyme into thinking that it's glycine. So it gets inserted into the protein in place of glycine. And then with that extra bulk sticking out, it messes everything up as far as how the protein works, especially if it's at some critical place. And there are many, many glycines that are at critical spots in various proteins. You can rummage through the research literature and find all this stuff on, mutations. Like if someone has a glycine that's mutated at a particular spot in a particular protein, it ruins the protein and causes all kinds of bad diseases. So you can actually determine which proteins have especially sensitive glycine molecules, and then you can sort of deduce that they could be affected by glyphosate. And you can connect that to what we're seeing as far as which diseases are going up exactly in step with glyphosate and see if it makes sense in terms of the proteins that are associated with those diseases. It's a giant puzzle. And I love a puzzle, so this one is a real challenge, but it's been fun.
You say in the book it's a 3D puzzle.
Yes, it's an incredibly complex puzzle, but it's so much fun. And I feel like glyphosate has helped me to understand how biology works by virtue of the ways in which it disrupts it. So it's a good probe to help you understand biology, but then you realize how devastating it is to be exposed to this chemical on a regular basis. It's very, very dangerous.
And how much of this are these studies in humans? Because in the book, I know you talk about a lot of rodent studies. So there's a lot of animals data out there. Yes. I mean, they've shown, for example, that very low levels of glyphosate exposure to rats causes fatty liver disease. Below regulatory limits, it causes fatty liver disease in rats. A human study corresponding to that, they actually found people who had fatty liver disease, and they found that they had significantly higher levels of glyphosate in their urine on average than the ones who didn't have it. And the ones who had worse disease had significantly more glyphosate than ones who had a lesser form of the disease. So there was a nice correlation there between glyphosate and fatty liver disease in humans. But you're right, most of the studies have been on animals. And many of the studies, early studies, used very high levels of glyphosate. And they missed the fact that glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor. And that actually changed a great deal following a paper that was published by Seralini and his team in France in 2012. They published a paper which was a low-dose exposure to glyphosate over their entire lifespan for these rats. And they found at 3 months the rats were doing fine. So it's a slow kill. That's part of the reason why we haven't been able to see it. It's a slow kill. So the rats were doing fine at 3 months. At 4 months, they started to have problems.
by the end of their life, they had all kinds of issues with, the females had massive mammary tumors, and the males had liver damage and kidney damage, and both sexes had issues with their reproductive system, and they had early death. So they were very much affected by the glyphosate, but it took time. And once that paper was published, it actually got retracted because of pressure from the industry, and then republished. So it still is alive. A lot of controversy around it. But after that, in more recent years, there have been a lot of papers that have come out with low-dose glyphosate studies, because they weren't even doing those studies before, because they figured if it wasn't toxic at high levels, it wouldn't make any sense to do a study at lower levels. You wouldn't find anything. It'd be a waste of money. So once they realized it really was causing problems at the lower doses, they started doing the studies, and they found all kinds of trouble. And in fact, they found in more recent studies, exposing a pregnant rat or mouse to glyphosate during pregnancy, again, low levels of glyphosate, so low that the mouse seems fine, the offspring seem fine, but when they grow up and have their pups, and especially when the next generation has its pups, things get worse and worse. So this is called epigenetic effects that are long-lasting. The germ cells in the fetus reacted to the glyphosate with a memory reaction that caused them to change their policy. And those problems showed up in later generations. It's really fascinating.
Pottinger's
that
cats.
This can happen.
It sounds like Pottinger's
cats. Yes, I
and...
know. Yes, that's right. It's just, it's really amazing that exposure to the great-grandmother can be seen as symptoms in the great-grandchild.
Well, a lot of this stuff, the problem with kind of our understanding of nutrition world is it's slow acting poison, and you don't really see it. So then people are like, oh, I don't know, we just eat cereal and eat all this stuff and you're fine, because it's such a slow acting thing that it's hard to actually see.
Yeah. That's why we don't connect the dots. People don't realize that it's causing their symptoms, because it's hard. And of course you don't taste it too. It tastes fine, which is unfortunate that we can't taste it. It'd be nice if it had some kind of a nasty taste that you could actually tell you were getting exposed. We need to improve our taste buds so we can detect it, because that would really help a lot if you could know that you were being poisoned with it. But because it's a slow kill, you don't really recognize what's happening until it's too late. And even then you don't recognize it, right? You just don't realize that it's this chemical that's causing all your problems.
Well, partly they don't want us to recognize it. Like you said, Monsanto blocked and retracted the study and used lobbyists and all the pressure. And so that's part of the problem.
Yes, and of course they're denying that what I'm saying is possible, actually. They're saying it's not possible for glyphosate to get into the proteins in place of glycine. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out with my book, because I tried to give as strong an argument as I could in my book that it looks to me like that's what's happening. And it makes a lot of sense in terms of what you see as far as the disease patterns. And the question is, am I right? That's the big question.
Well, yeah. Well, so July 1st it comes out?
Yes, right around the corner.
Okay, yeah. So we're recording this 2 days before that, and then by the time this airs, go get it. But let's go back to the soil. We talked about the soil, and it does persist in the soil. Monsanto tries to say that it washes, it doesn't. And then we talked about the minerals too, right? About just preventing enough minerals from the plants.
Yeah, it keeps the minerals out of the plants. That was one of the things that Professor Huber talked about in his presentation. He showed dramatic drops in the levels in sulfur as well. So sulfur and zinc and cobalt and manganese, all these minerals were way down in the plants. They weren't getting taken up by the plants because glyphosate was disrupting the mechanism by which the minerals are taken up. And so, our body has developed, and it's the same is true for us. It's messing up our regulation of our minerals so that they become simultaneously toxic and deficient. And I think that's happening to both manganese and iron, and probably zinc as well, both toxic and deficient at the same time, because the whole process of carting them around and getting them to where they need to go and getting them delivered into the cells is all broken. Much of that is broken by glyphosate. And part of it is just that glyphosate binds really tightly. It's a very strong chelator. It binds to these minerals and makes them unavailable. And that's particularly effective on lactobacillus, because lactobacillus depend critically on manganese to protect them from oxidative damage. And glyphosate binds very strongly to manganese and makes it unavailable to the lactobacillus in your gut, which causes them to be deficient.
I love that.
I have a whole paper on manganese.
Oh, well, we could get into so many different minerals. I mean, we talk about aluminum. We'll talk about aluminum soon, but I love that you say simultaneously toxic and deficient. That's what our whole diet is. I think it's simultaneously toxic and deficient. It's
absolutely
yeah.
true. Yes. Yeah, but it's really unfortunate that we aren't able to use the minerals the right way. And manganese in particular ends up in, I wrote a paper together with Anthony again on manganese. It was a very interesting topic that we dug into with respect to Parkinson's disease, because there's a condition called manganism that is found in welders, because the welders are breathing manganese into their nose, and it's traveling along the olfactory nerve and ending up at the brainstem and causing this condition, manganism, that looks a whole lot like Parkinson's disease. And it turns out that manganese can also travel along the vagus nerve from the liver to the brainstem and end up causing Parkinson's disease. So what's happening is the manganese is going to the liver, and then it's not, normally it gets released in the bile acids. It attaches to the bile acids and it gets released back to the gut, and then it goes into the circulation through the lymph system and eventually gets into the blood and delivers all over the body. But that whole process gets bogged down because glyphosate messes up the supply of the bile acids. It really disrupts the bile acids. And that's partly through the cytochrome P450 enzymes. But because of that, the manganese piles up in the liver and becomes toxic. So the liver just unloads it, ships it down the vagus nerve over to the brainstem. So the brainstem becomes highly concentrated with excess manganese, which is toxic. And meanwhile, all the rest of the body is deficient, including other parts of the brain, are deficient in manganese. So it's just not being distributed. It's being distributed incorrectly and causing both toxicity and deficiency at the same time.
Well, and go back to chelation, because, glyphosate is a chelator. And what's the history, actually, of glyphosate as a chelator?
Well, yeah, that's how it was first used. It was originally patented as a chelator, a way to clean metals off of pipes. So to clean
great.
the pipes. Yeah, I know. And they were even using it in water tanks, the tanks they were holding water, to use the glyphosate to clean the tank. So that was in 1961, I think, and it was a Stauffer or something, a chemical company that did that patent. And then Monsanto patented it in 1968 as a weed killer. It's just they discovered accidentally that it kills plants. And then they thought, wow, this is great. We can use it as a weed killer. And so they patented it in 68. And then it came out really in the 90s. So it's been around for a long time. It first came out in the mid-1970s. And so it was being used all the while up to about the end of the 1990s. And that's when they came up with all these GMO Roundup-ready crops. And so the use of glyphosate went up dramatically over the first decade of this century, from 2000 to 2010, dramatic increase in glyphosate usage on those GMO crops. So great expansion of GMO crops. They were resistant. You could just spray the glyphosate all over the crop. It didn't die. That's very dangerous because it ends up in the food supply.
Well, yeah, that's an important point, because actually years ago, I didn't know what the problem with GMO was. It's not necessarily the GMO part. It's the fact that you can spray it with glyphosate and that it's protected. So you genetically modify it so that the crop is safe, but it kills the other plants around it.
Yeah, and it kills you when you eat the crop. So that's the problem. And it's interesting because I remember the GMO arguments were never really centered on the toxic chemicals for a long time. People were worried about the GMO technology and how that's affecting, the genome and all of that, and what kind of weird things could it do. I mean, that's definitely something to wonder about. But the fact that the GMO enabled the glyphosate was really, I think, a critical part of what made the GMO crops toxic. And when they studied the GMOs to see if they were safe, they didn't use glyphosate. I was so shocked to find this out. When they produced these GMO crops that were glyphosate resistant, and then they're testing to see if they're substantially equivalent, they grew them without glyphosate. So, I mean, that's like, hello, right? And even when they test glyphosate, they tested it without all the other stuff they add to the Roundup. The Roundup, they add all these adjuvants and surfactants that make it much more toxic, much more able to be taken up by the plant. So that the surfactants, the extra ingredients in Roundup, make the glyphosate in Roundup much more toxic than glyphosate by itself is. But when they evaluated glyphosate, they studied it in isolation. So they just did all these things wrong. They studied the GMO in isolation without the glyphosate. They studied glyphosate without the Roundup, just to get past the regulatory limits and make it look like this thing is okay. So this is one of the tricks they use to get it approved by the EPA.
They're crafty. They know what they're doing.
Yeah. I know, they're very crafty. That's a good word for it. And I even think they may have supplied these rules because of an observation, because they said you only had to look for 3 months And if you didn't see toxicity after 3 months, you were good to go. Well, Seralini showed you have to wait 4 months to see the toxicity of glyphosate. So they managed to avoid the long-term studies by just declaring that it's not necessary. And then they also said if it doesn't show toxicity at higher levels, you don't have to test it at lower levels. So that's how they avoided discovering that it was an endocrine disruptor, because they never studied it at those low levels.
It's insane. It sounds a little bit also like these like kind of high omega-6, like linoleic acid seed oils and stuff. And if you kind of look at it in the short term, they don't look so bad. But it turns out it's more of the long-term problem. And I don't know if you get into that type of stuff too.
I have actually, and I know Dr. Mercola is writing an entire book on linoleic acid and its derivative arachidonic acid. Those are really fascinating. I got kind of my eyes glazed over when I was studying fatty acids, because they go all over the place and there's all these different metabolites and you just get so crazy. But I did discover something rather basic. It's after I finished my book, so it's not in my book, but I discovered something remarkable, which is that arachidonic acid is a precursor to an endogenous cannabinoid that is a human form, in a sense, a human form of a cannabinoid that's marijuana, the active ingredient in marijuana. And you can convert your cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver are used to convert arachidonic acid into this endogenous cannabinoid, which is actually going to be beneficial to your brain. But when those cytochrome P450 enzymes are blocked, then the arachidonic acid goes down other pathways. And those include lipoxygenase and cyclooxygenase. These two enzymes, both of them produce each of them produces a different set of toxic metabolites that cause an inflammatory reaction. Very, very interesting. So in fact, I think the blockage of the cytochrome P450 enzymes may be a major reason why arachidonic acid is considered to be toxic. So it may not be the fault of the fatty acid. It's just because the enzymes that would normally take it down the right path are blocked by glyphosate. And then it goes down these other paths that cause disease. I think that's true in a lot of cases of, we don't. And the other thing I wonder about is we have all these studies that look at different kinds of fats, with different kinds of omega-3, omega-6, saturated fats, comparing them and trying to figure out. And none of those studies ever worry about how much glyphosate is in the fat. So they could be comparing one fat that has very little glyphosate and another one that has a lot. And the glyphosate may be the big reason why those things are behaving differently. But they're ignoring the glyphosate because they never think that the glyphosate might be playing a role. I think there's a lot of studies we're getting confusing results from different studies because some of them have a heavy dose of glyphosate, other ones don't. And they're not looking at that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it seems like most of the problems with bad studies is the confounding factors we don't think about, and this could be a huge one. Wow.
I think so. Yeah, I really think so. We get confused on the results of different studies and get conflicting results because they don't have the same thing that they're studying.
Wow. Well, let's keep moving. What about aluminum? So
yeah,
how does that play in? Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting too. And in fact, glyphosate is able to bind to aluminum. In fact, 2 glyphosate molecules can wrap around an aluminum atom and remove its +3 charge. So that's very interesting because you produce a small neutral charged molecule that is much easier to get across barriers. So glyphosate sets up a leaky gut barrier, and then it can hide the aluminum inside this little, glyphosate packet. And then that allows the aluminum to go across the gut barrier and get into the circulation. So normally the gut's very good at keeping aluminum out of the body. But when the gut is leaky, that different story, and especially when the aluminum is able to be bound to the glyphosate to hide its +3 charge. So I think glyphosate is actually encouraging aluminum to get into the body and actually to get into the brain. And then the glyphosate drops off the aluminum in the acidic environment of the brainstem. In the brainstem, when you get into the terminal watershed of the blood, it's lower pH. And the glyphosate unloads the aluminum, and then both the glyphosate and the aluminum become toxic at that point. So I think that, the pineal gland gathers a lot of aluminum. It has a lot more aluminum than other parts of the brain when you look at a postmortem analysis. It's outside of the brain, of the blood-brain barrier, so it's more accessible to aluminum being carried in, through the circulation. And so I think glyphosate is enhancing the arrival of aluminum into the brain and its damaging effects there. Glyphosate's helping that to happen. And there's another paper that talked about the same thing happening with another arsenic. Arsenic is very similar to aluminum, also +3 charge. And there was a paper from some people in Sri Lanka that talked about glyphosate escorting arsenic to the kidneys and dropping it off in the acidic environment of the kidneys. Very same story, the terminal watershed area where the pH is lower and the arsenic is unloaded from the glyphosate, and the arsenic becomes toxic to the kidneys. So I think it's making these toxic metals much more toxic than they would otherwise be.
Yeah. Well, how do people avoid some of the, well, first just avoid glyphosate, but just avoiding these toxic metals? I know a lot of people in the, more healthier lifestyle, ancestral health space realize they shouldn't be using deodorant with aluminum in it and stuff like that.
I know, that's absolutely true. Yes. And of course, sunscreen with aluminum in it. I mean, you really don't want aluminum. Aluminum is a very toxic metal. It has no role in biology. Absolutely none. It's always +3. It can't move around. So the other minerals, can go from +2 to +3 or +1 to +2. So they have interesting roles in redox reactions because of that ability to change their charge. But aluminum is always +3. So it's inert in that sense, but it messes up other things, especially it'll get in trouble with calcium. It'll fake it, pretend to be calcium, just like glyphosate pretends to be glycine. Aluminum pretends to be calcium and messes up calcium metabolism.
Well,
and it affects the neurons. I mean, it's very strongly connected to dementia. Aluminum in the brain, and also to autism. This Chris Exley did a study on autistic brains post-mortem, and he was quite shocked to find high levels of aluminum in the brains of these autistic kids.
Well, I don't want to talk about the V word, but it sounds like people are talking about you get some jabs and you get aluminum in your body.
Absolutely, injected past all the barriers. I think that's a very serious consideration.
It's interesting. Well, for the deodorant part, I mean, at Nose to Tail, we're making deodorant out of beef tallow. Actually, we use really good grass-fed beef tallow, so it doesn't use.
That's cool.
Yeah,
that's very nice. Yeah,
it's great. Actually, I'm testing it now. It works well.
That's wonderful. Good tip.
Yeah. So maybe we should move into tips. We're getting to the end here. We're tips on how to live better and not have all the glyphosate in your life. And so far, eat organic foods, eat grass-fed meat.
Yes.
What else?
And so I think organic eggs are super healthy. They've got lots and lots of, I look for nutrient-dense foods, and they have lots of micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. So eggs are really good, and seafood, oysters and clams and all those good guys are very, very healthy. Lots and lots of minerals and vitamins. So you want to be eating a diet that's rich in vitamins and minerals. And of course, cruciferous vegetables are great because they have sulfur. We eat a lot in my family. We have a lot of broccoli and Brussels sprouts and cauliflower and cabbage. I love all of those. And kale is also a cruciferous vegetable, I believe.
Do you get worried about oxalates do you eat them seasonally, or do you just? I mean, I just don't think people want to eat them too much.
Well, the oxalates are a good point, and that's another story where glyphosate plays a role. It turns out, and that's related to the PEPCK problem that I mentioned earlier, because it ends up producing excess amounts of a precursor to oxalates, and it encourages the growth of candida, which can convert this precursor into oxalates using candida enzymes. So it encourages the growth. Glyphosate encourages the growth of the fungus that produces the oxalates that causes the problem. So I think glyphosate is a connector in the oxalate problem. I know that kale, I think, is very high in oxalates, right? And I think some people are doing overdosing on kale smoothies, and that's probably not a good idea. I think if you eat kale as a physical plant, you're not going to be able to eat as much as if you zap it in the blender and drink it down. I think you're getting probably too much in that case.
That's a good point. Yeah, I used to do that and get too much. And so sulfur. So you're talking about we talked about sulfate and cholesterol sulfate and just having sulfur being a good thing. And so sulfur containing foods or animal foods.
Yes, and that's I mentioned the seafood is good for sulfur, and also the eggs. Animal-based foods have more cysteine, and cysteine is a sulfur-containing amino acid. That's really critical. In fact, glyphosate interferes with the synthesis of methionine, which is the basic sulfur-containing amino acid that can then get converted to the other sulfur-containing amino acids. So the methionine becomes depleted in the gut. It's the gut microbes that can make methionine out of inorganic sulfur, and those enzymes get disrupted by glyphosate. So that's another problem with not getting enough of the sulfur-containing amino acids. But you can get them from the much better source is animal-based foods rather than plant-based foods.
That's good to hear for my crowd. But also there are some, I always eat some herbs and plant-based foods with my meals, especially onions and garlic, which
They're great.
do have
I eat tons of them. Garlic you can't go wrong with garlic. I think you can't possibly get too much garlic. I love garlic. And we also use ginger, and I like some spices. Like I love the Chinese peppercorn. I don't know what they are for health, but they're probably good for you because I think it's so delicious. Chinese peppercorn, I just love it. Probably not too many people know about that one.
Oh yeah, I've not heard of the Chinese version. I don't know.
Peppercorn, yeah, it's very nice.
And then fermented foods. What do you?
Right, fermented foods are good, and it's possible that they contain microbes that can metabolize glyphosate. And I've talked about that possibility because there aren't many microbes that know how to break that CP bond in the glyphosate. And this Acetobacter is one of the species that is able to do that. And whether the Acetobacter that are in the fermented foods can do it or not is still undetermined. But I'm hoping that's the case, in which case it's a really good idea to eat sauerkraut and apple cider vinegar and those fermented foods that have potential to break down glyphosate.
That's great. What else? So far, this is music to my ears. Everyone listening knows my sapien diet is what I call it, which is basically what you just outlined. Sapien diet is grass-fed meat, nose to tail, animal foods, pasture-raised eggs, seafood, oysters, fermented vegetables, some other herbs, spices, onions, garlic. It's everything you just said.
You're describing my diet, so I'm in agreement with you.
I love that so much. Getting out in the sun too. You're talking about getting in the sun, getting vitamin D. You are just music to my ears. So what else? Is there any other diet and lifestyle things?
Well, I like Epsom salt baths. I do that regularly, just throwing some Epsom salts into the bath water in a really hot bath. I sort of like a sauna almost. I think sauna is probably good as well because you can release toxins with sauna. So Epsom salt baths and
for the magnesium specifically, or just
for the sulfate. People don't realize that it's magnesium sulfate. The magnesium is probably good too because a lot of people have magnesium deficiency, but magnesium sulfate. Do you hear that noise?
Yeah.
I just don't know if I should close my door.
It's okay. No, it wasn't that bad. It sounded like a motorcycle went by. It's all good.
It's getting noisier and noisier. They're right outside my yard. The guy's working in the yard right now.
It's all good. We can wrap it up here in a second. If you have any other kind of lifestyle thing.
Yeah, well, there are people that are recommending certain products that are being sold, like Ion Biome. I don't know if you've heard of Ion Biome. That's supposed to help to clear glyphosate. People are generally giving it good thumbs up. Ion Biome, and then that also has fulvic acid and humic acid, which are organic matter from the soil, and they're apparently able to bind to the glyphosate and help to pull it out through the feces. Again, these are sort of, I think, theoretical things at this point. We're not sure, but they're known to be binders, and so people are hoping they could help to clear the glyphosate in the gut. But it's very hard to get rid of the glyphosate that's in your proteins, and you need to do that by fixing your sulfur problem so that you can break things down. So you can break down those proteins that have glyphosate embedded in them, and then hopefully get the glyphosate out.
So go back to the sulfate part or sulfur part just one more time. I want to know exactly how the sulfur, maybe in more high level terms for people.
Yes.
Easy to understand why you want that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the sulfate I said is really important for the for the lining of the blood vessels, to make that structured water, the gelled water that allows the red blood cells to slide through the capillaries. But it also is this heparin sulfate is the molecule that's all over the blood. Lining the blood vessels, heparin sulfate. And heparin sulfate is a super critical molecule for attracting. It's where a lot of things bind, like the LDL particles, for example, bind to heparin sulfate, and then they're taken up into the cell and broken down and recycled. Like if you have, it's how the cell gets nutrients and how it gets signaling molecules, all kinds of things connect up with the cell through the heparin sulfate. So when the heparin sulfate is deficient, the cell actually becomes kind of incommunicado and it's not able to get the messages that it needs from what's coming through the blood. It misses out on lots of things because of its heparin sulfate deficiency. And the heparin sulfate gets taken up, for example, with the LDL particle, with anything that's being digested and cleared, the cell takes up heparin sulfate along with it. The stuff binds to the heparin sulfate, the whole thing gets taken up into the lysosome, and the lysosome breaks it down. And the lysosome depends upon, and it breaks down the heparin sulfate as well. So it breaks off the sulfate, and it uses the sulfate to help with the whole digestion process that breaks down the broken metabolites. So you're trying to clear cellular debris in the lysosomes with the help of heparan sulfate to do that. So when the heparan sulfate is deficient, first of all, the blood circulation is bad. And even I said the LDL particles, they have sulfate, they have cholesterol sulfate in their membranes. So that's another one. Cholesterol sulfate and heparan sulfate are both really important for maintaining systemic health, really. And the brain, heparan sulfate in the brain, there's a study that showed that mice that were deficient, they were made to be deficient in heparan sulfate production in the brain ventricles, and they developed all the symptoms of autism just from that one defect. So heparan sulfate is super important in the brain for the development of the brain. So it's a very, very important molecule, heparan sulfate, very extensive throughout the body, critically involved in cellular communication and in the digestion of cellular debris, the clearing of debris. So it's just like you need as much as you can get, and it's deficient in association with cancer as well. So it's, cancer cells actually make lots of heparan sulfate, and it gets ripped away from them by digestive enzymes. So they're supplying heparan sulfate to the immune cells, I believe. The cancer cells are serving a role of helping the immune cells to get enough heparan sulfate to be healthy. Because when the immune cells don't have enough heparan sulfate, they can't do their job.
That's not good. I'm all about the immunity, natural immunity, and keeping up a good immune system. And I guess to do that.
Well, people don't realize about heparan sulfate, but if you start looking into it, and I actually discovered it very early in my research, long before I met glyphosate. Really, when I first started looking into autism, I identified heparan sulfate, defective heparan sulfate as a factor in autism. And really fascinating molecule. And we're realizing now its importance more and more as we research more. People are realizing the importance of heparan sulfate. But it's the enzymes that provide the sulfate, I think, are defective in the context of glyphosate. And so sulfate becomes deficient.
Wow. All right. I think we did it. We don't want to give away your entire book here, but
we probably overwhelmed people with some of that at the end. But
might have to listen to this one twice. But amazing information. Anything else you want to say on our way out here?
Just stay healthy and get your sunlight, eat your organic diet, and eat your whole food. Spend time in the kitchen. Go ahead and cook some nice dishes with a lot of spices. It's worth it, and it can be fun once you get into it. I think to be taking the time you need to make your food be healthy, to eat a healthy diet, very, very important for long-term health of your family.
I think it's one of the most important things, and it's the thing that I do the most. And part of my journey over the years has moved towards cooking all my own food. And
I know it's what happened to us too. My husband's a great cook, so I'm very spoiled, but he's gotten more and more of a perfectionist, so organic whole cloves with garlic. It's not enough to just buy it already chopped up. You have to chop it yourself, So he walks the extra mile, which is fantastic. So
I love that. It's almost that process in itself is healing in a sense, where you're taking care and being very thoughtful about what you're doing and putting,
and food can be a tremendous pleasure if you really focus on food as part of the pleasures of life. I think people are always in a rush. They just grab a hamburger, they feel like they just have to stuff their face with food to just keep going because they're so busy with other things. But we should really take the time, I think. It can be a very pleasurable part of living, and to eat healthy food.
Well, exactly. Some people take the wrong pleasure in food. They'll take the pleasure in getting like the most ridiculous burger with the most fries and milkshake and decadent type of thing. But you can take pleasure in making your own food, and it's
exactly
much
healthier.
I love it. All right. Yeah. Well, your book should be for sale by the time this goes out. Do you have any website, or what do you have?
Yes, I have stephanieseneff.net is my website, and you can go stephanieseneff.net/book, and you can find all the booksellers. There's a number of different booksellers that I've listed there that are selling the book. So Amazon, of course, but many others as well.
All right.
It's available on major booksellers, and I'm excited to have it out. We'll see how that goes. But
that's so cool.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming on, and maybe we'll check in again sometime.
And it's Toxic Legacy. That's the name of my book, Toxic Legacies.
It is. I'll post a picture of it too.
Oh, great. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Go to nosetotale.org and get yourself some meat. Please share with friends and family. Give it a review on iTunes or any podcast app. Go to sapien.org to see what we're doing there. Has links to the film, to Nose to Tail, to the Sapien program, to the Sapien tribe, all the great things. Be part of the community. Eat well, live well. Let's do this, everyone. We'll see you next week.